It's the bloodiest battle of the entire Ukraine war, with some estimating that this one battle alone has cost Russia 100,000 casualties since it began 10 months ago. The strategically insignificant town of Bakhmut has now turned into what could be a turning point in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has explained how Russia is failing in Bakhmut. General Milley described the fighting in Bakhmut as a slaughter fest, with some estimates placing Russian losses at 5 for every 1 Ukrainian. Conservative estimates place the dead and wounded in the fighting for Bakhmut at 20 to 30,000 Russians, while the higher-range estimates for the fighting in Bakhmut and the immediate surrounding area go as high as 100,000. The real number is likely somewhere in between those two, but one thing is for certain: Russia is losing a lot more troops than Ukraine is. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was heavily criticized both from without and within at the start of the new year for his dogged refusal to withdraw Ukrainian troops from the town. His American advisors, the same ones that rewrote Ukraine's fall offensive plans and helped turn them into a hit, all warned him that it was time to leave the city. Domestic, military, and political figures all argued the same, yet Zelensky refused. Bakhmut is of very small strategic significance. Taking Bakhmut would allow Russia to threaten a few neighboring towns, but wouldn't affect the war in any significant way. But the Ukrainian army has made Bakhmut strategically significant by filling it with mountains of dead Russians. It's now one of the greatest repositories of sunflower fertilizer in the entire nation. As we approach the midpoint of May and the Ukrainian counteroffensive is expected to begin, in fact it may have already begun by the time you see this video, Zelensky's gamble has proven to pay off in spades. By refusing to vacate Bakhmut, Ukrainian forces have ground the Russian army down significantly, inflicting especially catastrophic losses on the infamous Wagner group, which was tasked with the taking of the actual city itself. Their failures in Bakhmut have even worked to sabotage Russia's war effort internally, pitting Wagner's Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Russian Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu against each other. With Russian military troops responsible for securing Wagner's flanks as frustrations mounted, there are credible reports of Russians and Wagner units getting into firefights with each other, and Prigozhin and Shoigu have been in an ongoing feud that's directly prevented victory in Bakhmut since the fight for the town has started. Russia now has only but 2 kilometers left to take of the city to fully occupy it, but Ukrainian forces have begun to counterattack and reclaim territory from exhausted Russian troops, pushing both Wagner in the city proper and the Russian military in the flanks back. The battle for the city has also helped to distract a significant amount of Russian firepower, thus reducing the strength of the offensive operations elsewhere. After 10 months of fighting, Bakhmut has become a blessing to an outnumbered Ukrainian military, allowing them to catastrophically whittle Russian forces down in one very defensible location. Zelensky's gamble has paid off so well that many are now wondering if the American protests against his continued refusal to remove troops was nothing more than an elaborate misdirection meant to encourage the Russians to continue attacking. General Mark Milley broke down Russia's failures in Bakhmut to problems with command, logistics, basic tactics, and troop training. On the command front, the Russian military has proven to be an antiquated fighting force that depends entirely on a heavy Soviet-style top-down command structure. It's an inflexible giant, much like its Soviet predecessor, only corruption in the Putin era has hollowed out what military proficiency its officers once had in the Soviet military. The basic flaw of the modern Russian army is that it is an incomplete force, with a command chain that relies almost entirely on commissioned officers due to a critical lack of non-commissioned officers. NCOs are the very backbone of a modern professional military. They ensure orders from a unit's commanding officer are carried out efficiently and swiftly, and help police the ranks from within to maintain order and discipline. Good NCOs are critical because officers are too few in number to effectively command an entire unit. Their specialized training makes them a rare resource, especially the higher up the chain of command you go. Russia has few NCOs, and it's not uncommon to see entire Russian units where the most senior non-com is the equivalent of an American corporal. With such few officers to go around, Russia's officer corps is completely incapable of maintaining even basic training and discipline standards. And this is a significant problem because Russia's military is already well known to be a chaotic, abusive institution where the older recruits and conscripts actively prey on the younger ones for money, sex, food, and alcohol. But when it comes to battlefield operations, Russia's lack of NCOs is an absolute disaster. Russia impressed the West with its Zapad 2017 and 2021 exercises, a combined arms operation that saw Russia responding to a conflict on its border with Europe. Zapad 2021 featured 200,000 military personnel, 760 vehicles, helicopters, planes, and other pieces of heavy equipment, and 15 ships. Russia even deployed the first all-robotic combined arms force featuring ground and air drones. The exercises simulated an enemy penetration strike into Russian territory, surrounding said enemy and then assaulting to destroy the target, followed by a rapid counterattack. It was a thoroughly impressive affair, and just months before the invasion of Ukraine, major news outlets were trumpeting the might and ferocity of the modern Russian forces. It was also all highly rehearsed and choreographed to look as good as possible, and it worked. When the rubber hit the road in February 2022, what followed was not the same Russian military that had just put on the world's largest dog and pony show months prior. An absolute clown brigade stumbled across the border into Ukraine and proceeded to make military blunders so legendary that they're even now being written into new editions of textbooks in war colleges around the world. In short, Russia was high off its own copium, but at a fundamental level, it was an attempt to conduct a very complicated combined arms maneuver with a force lacking NCOs to ensure orders were being followed accurately. In peacetime, with nobody shooting at you, it's easy to have 200,000 soldiers all do their job that they've been rehearsing. But the moment the bullets started flying, many Russian soldiers discovered they had no desire to join the May Day Parade Immortal Regiment. Typically, this is where NCOs would step in to ensure discipline under fire. But Russia didn't have enough NCOs to make it happen. The situation got so bad that Russia started having to place senior officers directly in the trenches with their units, a thoroughly catastrophic waste of resources with predictable results. Russia has suffered astonishing rates of KIA among its commissioned officer ranks, including an astonishing 14 generals. Just in the second week of May, Russia lost a commander and a colonel in Bakhmut fighting off Ukrainian counterattacks. This now leaves those all-important positions to be filled by even less experienced replacements because it takes years of military education to become a competent senior officer. However, further hampering Russia's ability to command its forces is the fact that there is no single unified military force fighting on Russia's side. Instead, the entire Russian offensive is made up of different factions. The largest by far is the Russian military, but Wagner PMC is a significant part of the Russian effort. Gazprom, the state-owned oil company, also has its own mercenary fighters in the conflict, as does Sergei Shoigu, who heads up Patriot PMC. Then there's Syrian volunteers and the infamous Chechen forces, who are absolutely crushing the TikTok war, but not doing so hot in actual combat. Each of these factions has their own agenda and are extremely disincentivized to cooperate in accomplishing the overall goal of victory over Ukraine. Nominally, they are all under the command of the Russian Ministry of Defense, but there is truly no unified command structure. And this just isn't incompetence, it's a large part by design. Putin, like any dictator, fears his subordinates as they are the most likely to attempt to remove him from power. Thus, it's important for a dictator to ensure that his subordinates are all motivated to directly oppose each other, preventing them from banding together to overthrow him. Putin fully embraces Byzantine politics, with the various arms of his own government often directly at odds with each other, and he has very carefully selected who to place in what position so as to ensure nobody can be a true threat to him. The Minister of Defense is a pretty important position and the most likely of any cabinet member to have the resources to oust Putin from power. They are, after all, in command of the nation's entire military. This is why Putin chose Sergei Shoigu to be the Minister of Defense. He's a Kremlin outsider who comes from a politically unimportant family. This ensures that he has no ties to the national elites, and without those ties, he's completely dependent on Putin to maintain his own grip on power. Likewise, Putin carefully chose Yevgeny Prigozhin to be the head of a private military company that would serve as a direct arm of the Russian government, while maintaining plausible deniability. Wagner PMC is an anomaly in a nation where mercenary companies are illegal. It's not just the largest of the PMCs operating in Russia, it is the most well-supported by the Russian government, with a significant amount of its own heavy combat equipment and facilities directly situated on Russian military bases. The fact that PMCs are technically illegal, however, means that Putin could end Wagner's operations at any time he wished. However, his choice of using Prigozhin to build this unofficial extension of Russian power and influence was not an accident. Like Shoigu, Prigozhin is also a Kremlin outsider. He's a petty crook who did prison time during the Soviet days for theft before getting out and eventually starting a successful restaurant business. Prigozhin is a street rat in the eyes of the Russian elites, and he has few friends amongst the oligarchs and political powerful who run the nation, making him a safe bet to run a shadowy and heavily armed organization that could potentially pose a threat to Putin's power. Putin has masterfully pitted Prigozhin against Shoigu to ensure the two heads of the best-equipped military forces in Russia hate each other too much to cooperate. But the rivalry between the two has heated to the point that it's now directly sabotaging victory in Bakhmut and elsewhere. Prigozhin has publicly claimed multiple times that the Russian MOD was purposefully cutting him off of supplies. But starting in May, just as Wagner was pushing Ukraine's defenses to the very edge of Bakhmut, the supplies mysteriously ran out. While at the same time, regular Russian military forces on the Bakhmut flanks attempted to push forward to finally fully encircle the city. Doesn't take a genius to figure out that Shoigu was making a play for Bakhmut, hoping to cheat Wagner out of its victory instead of claiming it for himself. Prigozhin was naturally, absolutely furious, uploading a series of rants to social media aimed directly at Shoigu and the rest of the Russian senior military staff. He even threatened to pull his forces out of Bakhmut by May 10th if Wagner didn't receive the requested resupply, prompting the defense ministry to issue Prigozhin an order warning him that abandoning his positions would be tantamount to treason. Eventually, Wagner received the requested supplies, only for them to be denied again 2 days later, prompting a new tirade from Prigozhin. Shoigu gave Wagner just enough to not leave Bakhmut, but not enough to finish taking the estimated 2 kilometers still defended by Ukraine. Because each faction in the Russian effort is directly disincentivized from working together, it's difficult to cooperate on the larger war effort, especially against a fully unified force such as the Ukrainian military. But it's outright sabotage that truly cripples the war effort, and it doesn't stop at glory stealing and supply shenanigans, although admittedly those have a direct impact on Russian casualties. In fact, there are mounting reports of Wagner directly handing over intelligence to the Ukrainians on the location of senior Russian military officers, who were subsequently visited by St. HIMARS. Astonishingly, the Discord leak of U.S. intelligence revealed that Prigozhin was in direct contact with Ukrainian intelligence in January as his troops were taking heavy losses. He offered to exchange Bakhmut for the location of nearby Russian forces, in effect allowing Prigozhin to claim victory in Bakhmut while giving Ukraine the chance to launch devastating attacks on the Russian military. Russia's logistics problem is almost as crippling as its command problem. Famously, the Russian military has proven that its logistics are terrible. This was already suspected by many who saw similar problems in the logistics of the Soviet military, but the Soviets expected to fight a truly apocalyptic war in Europe, and thus figured that individual units would be so completely exhausted in combat that there'd be few survivors to resupply. Thus, it was easier to simply replace them with a fresh unit than establish a proper and expensive logistics network. There might have been some truth to this. The Soviets could call on a truly astonishing amount of manpower from both the Soviet Union and its allies. But modern Russia didn't change a thing about their Soviet logistics, and it's nowhere near as large or capable as the Soviet Union. The basic problem with Russian logistics is that each unit doesn't have significant logistical support in terms of trucks and manpower. Compared to an American unit, Russian units have about half the logistics personnel and rely extremely heavily on rail to resupply. Yet the further they move from safe railheads, the worse the logistics problems become, as a small number of trucks have to undertake more and longer trips to pick up and drop off supplies. This is why weapons like HIMARS have been so important for Ukraine, and why it's been begging for the ATACMS from the US. ATACMS, or similar weapons, would allow Ukraine to push Russian logistics hubs even further back, dramatically slowing the rate of resupply and severely limiting Russian combat operations. And Ukraine just got its wish, at least partly, thanks to the donation of Storm Shadow air and ground-launched cruise missiles. Donated by the UK, Storm Shadow will allow Ukraine to strike up to 350 miles with precision, though it does depend on which variant the UK is donating, as the export version features about half that range. The missile is also low observable, giving it much greater survivability against Russian air defenses than ATACMS, for example, which might make it the superior choice. But even without Storm Shadow missiles threatening Russian logistics, the problems were already mounting for Russian operations in Bakhmut. Things would only get more difficult as the entire Russian war effort simply ran into an ammunition shortage. Suddenly, Russian artillery superiority dropped from last summer's 20-1 to 8-1. At times, even just 6 Russian fire missions for every 1 Ukrainian. A similar lack of precision weapons and drones have significantly affected Russia's ability to win in Bakhmut. Attempting to destroy the Ukrainian fighting spirit, Russia has opted to launch its precision weapons at civilian targets instead, with predictably poor results. This has consumed a significant stock of Russian weapons that are now no longer available to use on military targets. But Russia compounds its errors by immediately using up new stocks of weapons the moment they become available, rather than saving them for saturation attacks or in support of a prolonged campaign. Kyiv is claiming it's now intercepting about 90% of Russian missiles and suicide drones, and it doesn't have just Western air defenses to thank, it's Russia's failure to launch saturation attacks that overwhelm Ukraine's air defenses. Russia's so desperate for any victory that it expends its dwindling resupply almost as soon as it becomes available. Russian tactics are the next greatest deficiency in Bakhmut, according to General Milley, and it has been evident since the assault on Kyiv at the start of the war. Russia, which absolutely dwarfs the Ukrainian military, has proven to be a blundering giant, with a much more agile Ukrainian force consistently outmaneuvering it. Russia's bad tactics go hand in hand with its training problem highlighted by General Mark Milley. Simply put, its soldiers aren't properly trained for combined arms tactics, and those few that were have now been attrited through constant fighting. They've been replaced by even less experienced recruits and conscripts who are themselves attrited even faster in a phenomenon known in the military as a death spiral. Inevitably, Russia's been forced to rely on its overwhelming artillery advantage, but artillery cannot take and hold ground, which means Russia must assault Ukrainian defenses with World War I tactics. Weapons have evolved significantly since World War I, making these human wave attacks even more catastrophic and less effective than they were 100 years ago. Wagner's discovered a way to use human wave attacks in a particularly effective way, or at least they had, as it's no longer an option for them. Last year, Wagner PMC got the green light from the Russian government to recruit directly from prisons. Hardened criminals serving sentences for murder, robbery, rape, and drug charges were all given the chance to receive a pardon if they served a 6-month contract in Ukraine with Wagner. Wagner naturally would do everything it could to ensure that none, if any, made it to that 6-month mark, though in January the first group of survivors received their promised pardons. Wagner began to utilize prisoners in large human wave attacks meant to pin down Ukrainian defenders in Bakhmut. Once the prisoners had fixed Ukrainian positions, Wagner would send its more elite forces to attack in identified weak spots. The tactic was incredibly costly for the prisoners in the human wave attacks, but just as effective in defeating Ukrainian defenses. However, there were only so many prisoners to sacrifice to Ukraine, and the problem was made even worse when the military saw how effective the tactic was and cut Wagner off from further prison recruitment so it could carry it out itself. So it was back to World War I over-the-top assaults for Wagner, and now it didn't have more disposable forces to simply throw at the defenders. Rather, Wagner was back to sending its experienced recruits to an early battlefield retirement. But if Russia had a significant advantage over Ukraine in combat vehicles and air power, why is it resorting to these primitive tactics? Combat is like an onion, and to achieve victory, each layer must be peeled away by a very specific tool, but this has to happen simultaneously as each tool used to peel each specific layer off this onion is itself vulnerable to other layers that other tools need to peel off. In essence, this is what combined arms warfare is all about, and Russia is terrible at it for reasons we mentioned earlier. Russia's poor training and doctrine has been evident since the start of the war and throughout. While it's shown an ability to adapt, Russia is still regularly sending armored units into battle without supporting dismounted infantry, leaving their armor vulnerable to enemy anti-tank teams. Their air support assets are famously underperforming. Russia lacks any significant suppression of enemy air defense capabilities, which require specialized planes and specially trained pilots, with Western pilots and planes so good that the acronym was changed to Destruction of Enemy Air Defenses. This has closed off significant portions of Ukraine to Russian planes. But it's also a lack of trained pilots that's significantly hurting its ability to overcome Ukrainian defenses in Bakhmut and beyond. Russia's already lacked significant ground attack capable pilots and planes, but as the war has claimed more and more lives, the pilots Russia is fielding today are increasingly less capable than their predecessors. Russia also appears to be leery of attempting to utilize large parts of its own air force over Ukraine, given that it's proven to not be able to deconflict its air defenses very well. To date, Russian air defenses have scored just slightly less kills on Russian aircraft than Ukrainian air defenses. With its experienced recruits and conscripts being attrited and units being made up of increasingly larger numbers of inexperienced conscripts and recruits, the Russian military has entered into the legendary death spiral. This has prompted many, including the former head of Roscosmos, Dmitry Rogozhin, to state that Russia's only chance for success in Ukraine is to use tactical nuclear weapons. And he is likely not wrong, because while Russia maintains the numbers advantage and could call on exponentially greater numbers of conscripts than Ukraine could, the simple fact is that Ukraine is suffering about a third the casualties Russia is. In Bakhmut, NATO estimates that Russia suffers 5 casualties for every 1 Ukrainian, and this means that more Ukrainian troops are achieving greater levels of veterancy at a time that Russian units are increasingly being made up of larger numbers of inexperienced and poorly trained troops. Numbers and metal matters in a long war of attrition, but neither will make up the difference versus an increasingly more experienced Ukrainian military armed with even greater numbers of advanced Western weapons that Russia cannot hope to match. Now put your boredom in a death spiral with how US would respond if Putin attacked first, or click this other video instead.